Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Colonial Wars, and we're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you read more about colonial British North America in the 18th century, you can key in on these terms in order to get a sense of what's going on. So, let's dig into it. The first term for us is militia. Now, I think some folks may have a traditional understanding of the idea of the Minutemen racing to the green at Lexington and Concord, and when they think of that, they think distinctly of the militia. That's essentially what they were, that's what they did, that's all they did. That's not really the case. The militia traditions, when it came to British colonies, grew out of earlier English traditions of communal defense that existed far earlier in the medieval period. Largely, you had local companies that were formed of men that were heads of households. They're largely grouped by class. Officers reflected class within the society, read all this stuff. And you had initial, immediate local companies. Much of this, though, there's a certain celebratory, cultural rite of passage of participating in it, not necessarily of long sustained military conflict, right? That kind of thing. There were select companies that would be formed by the colonial governments in the event that a call would be put out by royal authorities for soldiers to take part in an activity, to take part in an expedition, or to take part in a conflict. And in the 18th century especially, American colonists are going to be increasingly asked by the British to take part in a series of expeditions. Some of these will occur in the Caribbean, some of these will occur up north in Canada. It would vary, but if you lived in the colonies, if you were a guy, you lived in the colonies in, let's say, the 1740s or 50s or the early 60s, so kind of on the, right prior to the 7 Years' War and even during, and if you were young and fairly fit and seen as effective in sort of your company and that kind of thing, chances are you might be asked to go be a part of one of these expeditions. That brings us to our second term, stockade or blockhouse. So if you're familiar with the term stockade today, chances are you think of it as it would relate to the military and being a prison, right? So in the 17th and the 18th century, Europe still relied on fort construction as part of a defensive military posture. And stockades and blockhouses were sort of coming out of that particular tradition. So some would be built fairly permanently, others would be built quickly, and would be used for, immediate defense and the assumption that the colony was under threat or that kind of thing. Now, again, with that, it's important to mention that whole stronghold kind of defense concept is kind of, again, what that grew out of. Third point, Fort Louisbourg. Now, fortress construction across British North America, as well as New France or Canada, occurred throughout the arc of the 17th and the 18th centuries. Even there were a series of forts in Illinois, Fort Deschartres and others. So Fort Louisbourg is important because of where it's constructed, right? So Louisbourg is on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. So it's kind of the mouth of the St. Lawrence. It's well positioned. It's this big prominent space. And so, of course, the British in this age of colonialization and imperial war, the British are going to want to potentially have control of it. And so the French build a fort. They build this fort between 1730 and 1740. And 1713 and 1740, and the French and the British are going to fight over this for quite a long time. This brings us to our fourth point, which is King William's War. Now, King William's War occurs between 1689 and 1697, and it has other names, right? So it is also referred to as the 9 Years' War, or the war. It's part of this War of the Grand Alliance, right? So there, you've got the Glorious Revolution in 1688. You've got this transformation of the British state, and William kind of takes this war and engages in this wider conflict against the French. There's war on the continent, but then he also moves to the Americas. And there's a lot that sort of comes of this war, right? So part of it's control of the fur trade, part of it's war against the French. There are attacks against Quebec that occur here. So there's a lot that's involved, right? But it really kind of indicates that this conflicts in Europe are sort of coming over, into the Americas and really have an effect on the colonies. All right, that brings us to our fifth point. Our fifth point is Queen Anne's War. Now, Queen Anne's War is also known as the War of Spanish Succession. Now, this happens between 1701 and 1713, and the war really has to do with the fact that Louis XIV, who is by this point older, decides he wants his grandson to be the king of Spain, wants to put him on the throne, and the rest of Europe says no, and so Louis says, "All right, well, we're going to have a war." And so what you end up with is this fairly long and fairly drawn-out conflict, both across the continent and in the Americas, where allies of the British and others are doing battle against the French and others. And this has a number of implications for the colonies. So again, the idea of colonists are going to be forced out of these expeditions, but also you're going to see conflicts where the French are going to be forced to leave Port Royal, and they're going to have to give over Acadia to the British. Eventually, the grandson's going to be on the throne, but the functional result, of course, is that the French are going to have to give up a number of territories that they had fought hard for a very, 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 very long time. So, again, I think all of these conflicts really kind of demonstrate, one, the idea of the construction of the fortresses, the idea that they're looking at the Americas as kind of this imperial space to fight over, and then the other part of it is these expeditions that the colonists are going to be continually asked to be a part of as well, and that's really going to have an impact on American identity in the 18th century. So, thank you very much.